who had marched on February the 15th, 2003, and had marched many times before, might have whispered to the newcomers, it takes more than one march, and it does. And I think the question you raise is very important, because democracy, the word, has been such a noble concept, but has been terribly devalued. I mean, real democracy only ever came from extra-parliamentary activity. It came from the ground. That's not an opinion, it's there, we know it. You know, back to Cromwell's model army and through to the great Chartist movement of the 1830s and 40s, the movement that made the reform bills mean something. I mean, franchise was only won, universal franchise in 1929. How was it won? I would think the Chartists are the most interesting for me, because they defined democracy as the three: political democracy, social democracy, and economic democracy. And without, what we have is political democracy in bits of the others. And we every 5 years we go and we're asked to go and ratify a form of democracy that I think is a long way from what democracy in its modern sense was intended to be. I've just been in Venezuela. It's very interesting, because to hear Hugo Chavez actually quote the Charters and talk about the three elements of democracy, you never hear that in public discourse in this country now. It is not just about voting. In fact, the Charters actually said, if the vote is simply to ratify the same power, then that's undemocratic. It doesn't mean you have democracy. And the Bush administration's idea of democracy, and what it calls its project democracy, is to have a vote as long as the country is totally enthralled and in hock to the IMF and the World Bank, which of course means the US Treasury, and they call it something called neoliberalism, which is capitalism in its most Hobbesian form. You know, that's democracy. Well, it isn't democracy. And what we have here isn't democracy, because the democracy that meant anything, that came to Britain, that was won by the British, came through struggle at grassroots level, and it came through, well, I don't need to run over the past again, but the past does teach us. And I think it's something that we have to consider, because this sentimental blackmail, emotional blackmail every 5 years can't go on, and that's one of Mr. Blair's, I think, great achievements, is that he's destroyed it. Because every 5 years we vote Labour again, please. Why? Why? You know, and the why has to become a huge national debate. Where it goes from there, I don't know.
We'll take a question from there and then a question from over there in the middle. Thank you. Please. I have a question about the future, 21st century. Despite having a regime which is pretty brutal and greedy, America is still the largest democracy in the world, or democracy in the making, as you describe it. Despite committing the atrocities against Palestinians in the occupied territories, Israel is still inhabited by relatively free, intellectually innovative people. But we heard from other speakers in this conference, in this festival, that you know, the next 10, 20, 30 years belongs to China, and the center of military, political, economic power, as well as population, is shifting towards Asia, and China is governed by 3,000 old men who are not elected. And so, how does the future look, in your view, in a world where the moral authority of the West, if it ever existed, has eroded due to the atrocities committed by US and Israel, actually, also? Okay, thank you.
Well, I don't think it ever had any moral authority. not among the humanity that I've moved for most of my life. I don't think the West might like to think it has had a moral authority. Tell that to people who have been at the blunt end of Western rapacious power in many forms. Well, you know, again, you're right. That's the received wisdom. China is coming up. India is coming up. And as if we're spectators, we should sit back. China's coming up. Right. New power. Will they fight them? America has a plan. The Guardian recently had 2 pages from the Institute of Strategic Studies, that well-known organization that has been trying to scare us all the way through the Cold War. It had a report saying where all the flashpoints were in the world, China. They only had that much for the United States.